Segue. So you'll hear, I'll do a kind of mini book talk and take us through some of the main themes from the Consuming Temple, and then I'll move into the newer project, which is tentatively called Exiles on Main Street, although I'm not sure, with all due respect to the Rolling Stones, if I can actually call a book that, so I'm still kind of weighing that title. But it may be called Exiles on Main Street because it's as Andreas said, it's about émigrés, primarily German-speaking émigrés, and kind of how they affected suburban American consumer culture and life.
Germans or German Jews?
Well, that's actually thank you for feeling free to interrupt me. I like that.
And I just need to do.
Yeah, I mean that's actually an open question because most of the people I'm writing about are Jews, but not all of them were, and not all of them would have identified themselves as Jews, even if they were identified by the regime that they were fleeing as Jews. So that's and I'm used to the question of why does the Jewishness matter. So that is something we can certainly come back to in the Q&A, and I'll say a few things about it as we go. So the Consuming Temple, I don't know if any of you have read it, but it's an exploration of the sort of quote-unquote Jewishness of the German department store. And it shows the ways, or tries to show the ways that department stores were represented, imagined, and experienced as Jewish phenomena across a variety of media and social and political discourses in pre-Nazi Germany. And in the current project, in a way, I'm making the opposite point. Because what I noticed in the early stages of this research is that there were indeed a great many Jews who were active in designing the shopping centers and malls, the advertising campaigns, the consumer satisfaction surveys, all the things which really characterize American consumer culture in its kind of post-war heyday. But in this case, these phenomena were not seen as Jewish. So what I'll talk about is how in the German case, before the Nazis' rise to power, the department store and other branches of consumer culture are coded as Jewish, and then in the American context, the work that these émigrés do is seen as European. And with that label comes this kind of notion of European sophistication and European styles. So I'm going to basically make three arguments. The first is that what we think of as American consumer culture was to a great extent created by European émigrés fleeing Hitler's Europe. So in contrast to the widely held Americanization thesis, right, which stresses the unidirectional influence of American culture and commerce on the post-war world, I want to really take apart notions of what is American and what is European and reveal instead a kind of constantly evolving process of cross-fertilization and interaction between European and American art, culture, and commerce. The second argument I already really gave you, that I'll try to show that consumer culture as a whole, and the department store in particular, was coded as Jewish in the pre-war German context, but as European in the post-war or the kind of wartime context in the United States. And third, I'm only going to get to this at the very end and only start to lay the groundwork for it, but this is, I think, really where the new book project is heading. I'm interested in how these figures that I'm talking about, how they looked at consumer culture and the kind of nascent consumer industries in relationship to the threat of fascism. In other words, if looking at the American example of material abundance, incredible economic productivity, and a consumer-based economy, whether they saw that as a kind of bulwark against fascism, as we'll see with one of the characters I introduced, or in a more kind of Frankfurt School style of analysis, whether they saw that as something which kind of provokes the threat of fascism. Again, I'll only get to that at the end, but that's in a sense what I think where I'm settling as a kind of central problem for a lot of this research. So let me go back to the department store, and I'm going to give a little bit of sort of basic introduction to the history of the department store and to what I tried to do in the book. And I'm going to begin with the claim that the department store was a very visible part of a broader transformation in European and North American life in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, and that these stores stood at the center of what many historians and social scientists would term a consumer revolution. A set of dramatic economic, social, and cultural changes which altered people's relationship with goods, changed how they spent their time, and reconfigured how the genders related to each other. So along with other elements of modern consumer culture, such as the illustrated daily press, the advertising industry, phonograph recordings, and ultimately radio and television and on, the department store was the most conspicuous symbol of this modern transformation, the source of powers that contemporaries regarded with a mixture of awe and dread. This so-called revolution, beginning in the 19th century and reaching fruition probably after World War II in the 1950s, brought what social scientists often call a consumer society, defined by the historian Jean-Christophe Agnew as a society-wide structure of meaning and feeling organized primarily around acts of purchase. So we might fill in that definition by noting that in such a system, patterns of consumption, rather than position in the process of production, are what determine one's place in society, one's identity, one's sense of self, and indeed a society in which consumable objects play a disproportionate role in creating meaning or shaping individual and group experiences. So when compared to France, Britain, and the US, Germany experienced this transformation rather differently. For one, department stores and the other trappings of modern consumerism came later. Decades separated the opening of the Bon Marché in Paris, generally considered the first department store, and we can get into what makes a department store if you'd like, and the appearance of Hermann Tietz and Company in 1886, which is often labeled the first German department store, in Munich in this case, although again, what is first is not always so clear. And this gap can be explained in terms of Germany's comparatively later industrialization, the later completion of its rail networks, the correspondingly belated emergence of a middle class with buying power, and the persistence of cultural taboos against certain kinds of commercial activity. While French, British, and American department stores started in cities like London, Paris, New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, German Kaufhäuser began in places like Gera in East Central Germany and Stralsund on the Baltic Sea, and only reached Munich in the late 1880s, Berlin around 1890, 1891, so 30 to 40 years later than they got to Paris. German department stores then came later, but they expanded more rapidly, perhaps like the German economy overall, so that by the early 1900s they outnumbered their French and British counterparts. Above all, German department stores were controversial, and this was also the case in other countries, but as I think we'll see, the German reception of the department store was especially intense and contested. So on a cultural level, it was filled with darker themes, a kind of morbid fascination that coexisted with the excitement that greeted the opening of new department stores. And finally, as I've suggested at the beginning, the German department stores were nearly all Jewish-owned. Jews and images of the Jew were at the center of the raging controversies around consumer culture and the department store in Germany from the 1880s through the Nazi period, and even beyond in the 1960s, when they were no longer Jewish held, obviously, but they're still constructed as again, we can get into that later, but they're still kind of retrospectively thought of as a Jewish institution, which connects to the student movement in the 60s in interesting ways, I think. So much so that for many Germans in this period, the phrase Jewish department store would have sounded redundant. So 4 of the 5 major chains in pre-Nazi Germany were Jewish operated. Karstadt is the one exception. And perhaps 90% of the individual stores, although that changed when in the economic crisis after World War I, many of the individually owned stores went bankrupt and Karstadt bought up a lot of them, so they got a progressively larger share. But perhaps 90% of individual department stores in the earlier era, before World War I, were Jewish owned. But beyond the demographic level, writers, cultural critics, political agitators, and shoppers themselves associated department stores with Jews in a variety of ways. And this wasn't always a negative thing. I don't have this, I've left the slides out here, but some of the department stores actually advertised in the Jewish press and called attention to their Jewishness. The KaDeWe sold kosher food. In Berlin, they sold Jewish books. They have an abridged version of the Talmud, and several other Jewish writings, so they're not hiding this, and everybody knew this, and it's not always a negative thing, but it's a thing, I guess is the point I wanted to make. So, which way is up? I don't know if can you read the writing, the German small, so I'll just read the English. This is from Simplot System, 1898. We have the clearly non-Jewish merchant or smaller specialty store owner confronting the Jewish department store owner, saying, I've come to tell you that you've brought me to complete ruin with your dastardly pricing policies. There's nothing left for me to do but to put a bullet in my head And the department store owner notes, may I kindly direct you, the weapons department may be found on the first floor. And I include that slide because I think it encompasses this sense of, you can't beat the Jewish department store owner. And also, of course, that they have everything, right? They sell everything from A to Z. Werner Zombart argued that Jews demonstrated a unique, historically and racially determined aptitude for commercial capitalism and were thus bearers of economic modernity. And Zombart described the department store as a quintessentially modern development and the embodiment of the anonymous objectifying forces of capitalism and marketing, which he lamented were displacing traditional retail practices based on personal connections and loyalty. Operating on a less rarefied level, the pages of Germany's anti-Semitic press buzzed with debates about whether all department stores or only the Jewish-owned businesses deserved to be reviled and boycotted. And the Nazis famously targeted department stores in their 1920 party platform and in subsequent writings and actions. Simultaneously, more neutral and even sympathetic voices, Jewish and Gentile alike, simply assumed the Jewishness of the stores, as I mentioned a minute ago, and represented department store owners with what contemporary observers understood as typically Jewish features and characteristics. So the consuming temple began from the simple realization that Jews created most of the department stores in pre-Nazi Germany. But beyond that, these were vast commercial enterprises, right? So the scale of them is something that I was really struck by. Employing tens of thousands of people, enormous structures in the heart of some of Germany's major cities, right? So tourist attractions and leisure destinations. And it seemed, when I first thought of writing this book many, many years ago, it seemed really noteworthy that these were Jewish-owned and that they were seen as Jewish at the time, but that few historians had really been talking about that. In the time I thought of writing the book and actually finished the book, other people did, of course, catch on, and there was a lot of interesting work done about the denazification, about the sort of so-called Aryanization. That's not the best term to use, but you know what I'm talking about, and restitution claims, and that was one avenue of research that was followed up on pretty substantially. So it was clear to me that department stores were bound up with crucial changes in daily life, economic structure, urban organization, architecture, etc. in the modern period, and so I wondered how did people at the time see it? Did they think, what did they make of this conundrum? How did the Jewishness affect attitudes at the time? And what does it mean for historians today to call something Jewish, to call a business sphere or a space? And that is, again, a topic that some people have taken up in the meantime. So my approach was to collect basically as much stuff as I could, as much material as I could find, and this included a lot of literature, novels, plays, visual culture, advertisements, newspaper features, academic studies, in-house newsletters. And in these disparate sources, I found the same sort of tropes that repeated over and over again. And I found that these all, or several of them, resonated with really major themes in Jewish history. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of those. Jewish history and also in German culture. So there's the plug for the book. For example, for one, the railroad and the department store are intertwined in all kinds of ways. So without the railroad, the department store is impossible. But beyond that, the department store is often compared to a railway depot, a place for the collection of goods. And department store, here you see in these Karstadt ads, the department store on this kind of network of railway stations throughout Berlin. And again, a similar one, actually from the same advertising campaign, showing the Karstadt and Hermannplatz on the Berlin public transportation grid. And these were actually put in the backs of seats on trains. So again, this kind of recursive link of department store and train. And the here, yeah. So basically, this is for tourists. You're in a train to Berlin, can't miss Karstadt when you're there, right? So it's a tourist attraction. Being marketed that way. And again, here we have a KaDeWe advertising campaign. You can't read, this is KaDeWe Berlin in the center, and then these are all vacation destinations, and here they're selling ski clothes and this kind of stuff. So the campaign here is buy your winter clothes for your winter vacation at the KaDeWe before you then get on the train and depart from the KaDeWe to these other networks. So railroads maybe in themselves aren't particularly Jewish, But the idea of circulation is, and the kind of circulating network that runs through the economy, again, the way that Zombart might describe Jews as the intermediaries, and Marx writes about the circulation of capital. So here the department store is a kind of hub on this network of circulation that is organized by Jews. And then another theme in terms of gender, notions of the Jewish man and the kind of parasitic effect on German women, and this kind of tension between the fact that women were, of course, the overwhelming majority of the customers, the people who spent their time in department stores, and yet they were owned or managed by Jewish men, and this also provokes a kind of fear in many of my sources, which again resonates with this sort of constructions of the Jewish man as somehow pathological or dangerous or off. This is an image that we could spend the rest of the time unpacking, but I should probably move on. Okay, so I'm going to move on and talk about the consuming temple and why I chose the title. And I'll go back to Émile Zola, whose 1883 novel, The Lady's Paradise, is really the ultimate department store novel, and there are a lot of German imitators of Zola that I found, and most of them have the same sort of plot elements of Zola. And he wrote that the department store, these are in his notes, because he spent some time researching department stores in the archives in Paris, in the Bon Marché archives. He wrote, the department store tends to replace the church. It marches to the religion of the cash desk, of beauty, of coquetry, and fashion. Women go there to pass the hours as they used to go to church, an occupation, a place of enthusiasm where they struggle between their passion for clothes and the thrift of their husbands. In the end, all the drama of life with the hereafter of beauty. And in the novel itself, Zola writes of Boré, his protagonist, based on the Bon Marché founder Aristide Boucicault, quote, his creation was producing a new religion, churches, which were gradually being deserted by those of wavering faith, were being replaced by his bazaar. If he'd closed his doors, there would have been a rising in the street, a desperate outcry from the worshippers, whose confessional and altar he would have abolished. So in a so-called age of wavering faith, the secularizing pull of modernity, the department store fills the void. Acts of purchase replace religious ritual, reflecting on Baudelaire's notion that the modern metropolis caused a kind of religious intoxication. Walter Benjamin wrote that the department stores, quote, are temples consecrated to this intoxication. For French theorist Jean Baudrillard, writing in the 60s, just as medieval society was balanced on God and the devil, so ours, he wrote, is balanced on consumption and its denunciation. So he's here referring to the kind of ritualistic consumer drive. We buy things and then we feel guilty about it and condemn ourselves for these purchases, but yet the cycle sort of continues on and on. And this kind of drama is our version of the spiritual drama of earlier, more religious periods. So the Wertheim store on Leipziger Strasse, at the time, and to some extent still today, the central commercial artery in Berlin, was nicknamed the Cathedral. And architects like Erich Mendelsohn, who designed most of the Schocken stores I'll show in a few minutes, he spoke of the Gothic cathedral and the modern department store as the structures which best embodied the spirit of their times. So in architectural terms, you can compare the department store, as I've said, to a railway station, also to a museum or an exhibition hall. And all of these structures can be seen as modern iron and glass equivalents of the medieval church.
And what's the distinction between these buildings and the galleries? Gallery shops, like galleries.
Oh, the arcades that Benjamin writes about. Yeah, I mean, they're enclosed. That's the main distinction. They're all enclosed. They're also all owned by the same. And this is one of the key definitions of department stores, that it's centralized ownership of all of the different departments. They're also vertical, right? So they're 6, 7 stories, and they have architecturally they have this grand entrance. So this kind of grand foyer, which is there's a lot of good architectural analysis of how this kind of functions, how your eyes are drawn up in a way that mimics the experience of entry.
In an arcade, there might be competitors. There might be several millinery shops.
Exactly.
That are competing with each other, whereas here
it's one business. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so So let's now try to kind of connect the, I don't like that expression, connect the dots, but whatever, kind of, connect the dots, for lack of a better expression, the Jewishness of the department store and the religious dimensions of the department store. Those are different points, but how can we kind of work them together? So the German department store was often portrayed not just as a cathedral, an altar for the worship of the commodity, or a so-called cathedral of consumption, but specifically as a Jewish temple. And I'm going to give a literary example or two of that. And I'm going to mention a 1909 novel, Warenhaus Berlin, by a now unknown author, Erich Kerr, which is really, Warenhaus Berlin is to the KaDeWe what Ladies' Paradise is to the Bon Marché. So it's a very thinly, lightly fictionalized account of this department store. And the KaDeWe, as you may know, opened up in 1907. It was created by Abraham, although he changed his name to Adolf Jandorf, who was a Jewish businessman who operated 5 other department stores in Berlin. All of his other department stores were targeted for the working class and were really discounters. So the KaDeWe was distinct in that sense. It was bought by the Tietzes in 1923. In any case, the novel recounts Friedrich Nieland is the Jandorf character, and it recounts his ascent from a purveyor of dry goods into a veritable department store king, and his ambitious plans to create the eponymous Warenhaus Berlin. The proposed department store location, because like the real Jandorf, he had these other department stores, and then he wants to make his kind of crown jewel. He proposes to build it on Wittenbergplatz in Berlin. As you know, that's following the actual case. But the city officials, and this is also true of the KaDeWe, city officials were uncomfortable with this choice because of its proximity to a certain cathedral. Right, the Kaiser Wilhelm cathedral, which you can see here in the background, the Gedächtniskirche. And so Berlin building regulators feared that the department store might block the church, and that the church's, quote, the church's sanctity would be desecrated if the doors to a department store opened right across from its main entrance. That's a quote from the novel talking about the historical conditions. The church in the novel, the Gedächtniskirche, provides a background for the unfolding climactic events. So, for example, Kerr writes that on the day of department store Berlin's grand opening, quote, as the chimes of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church's bell tower trailed off into the clear winter air, the sea of lights of the new house flamed up. So the juxtaposition of the evangelical church and the Jewish temple of commerce, which in this case is a monument to greed and corruption, frames the novel's climactic events, which unfold in a highly allegorical manner. The church itself, as you probably all know, a memorial commissioned by the Emperor Wilhelm II to commemorate his grandfather, Emperor Wilhelm I, harkened back to an imagined traditional Germany of throne and altar that lay starkly at odds with the new consumer-oriented modernity furthered by the department store. The appearance of the department store next to the cathedral can be read as reflecting a larger tension in a society that was responding to rapid changes by looking backwards, attempting to revive discarded traditions just as they were on the verge of anachronism. So the climactic event in the novel is a fire which Nieland, the proprietor himself, sets after learning of his wife's infidelity. And symbolically, I argue, the fire resolves the tension, the provocation of the Jewish department store next to the cathedral in the center of Berlin. He describes the fire in quasi-biblical terms, writing, "It was as though the earth reared up in a mighty rage. A huge fist of flame, glowing red, raised itself up, stretched the tower up into the heavens, and then tore it down deep into the ground with an abrupt lurch. The store's entire interior collapsed in on itself with dull claps of thunder." There's another novel, Siegfried Sievert's 1928, The Great Department Store, which also ends with the fire destroying the department store. In that novel, it was compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, and in this case, it's more like the Babel story. So in this case, it's his hubris, the hubris of the owner who wants to make this majestic department store in the heart of Berlin, which resembled a city in and of itself, and this calls upon the destructive divine wrath. Again, the church provides a backdrop, a screen. You know what, I'm going to skip that, so I'm going to just move on. So what I want to then ask, what was, because I don't want to talk too long about this, so I leave a little room to talk about the other project. What was revolutionary about department stores? For many urban dwellers starting around 1900, the latest shopping emporium, display window exhibition, or special department store event, sales, fashion shows, art exhibitions, etc., elicited tremendous excitement. With cafes, newspaper reading and letter writing rooms, hair salons, banks and travel agencies, the department store was meant to be a leisure destination worthy of devoting a whole day. Its aisles and departments akin to a city within a city, ideal for meandering, sauntering, and taking in the attractions. Everything under one roof was a common motto, this in self-conscious contrast to traditional German commerce, in which merchants sold one type of good, over which they had expertise. Brashly breaking taboos, the department store thus marked a kind of social provocation, a perceived threat not only to existing business and commercial practices, but to prevailing gender roles and social norms, at a time of tremendous economic and cultural upheaval. So unlike traditional specialty shops, which consumers generally entered for the purpose of making a specific purchase, department stores welcomed casual browsers, ohne Kaufzwang. They sought to attract as many people as possible and keep them in the stores for as long as possible, right? So in the old sort of old, you get into trouble saying old-fashioned because they also modernized, but in the older model of the specialty shop, you go in when you need a specific thing, you bargain, you don't necessarily pay at any, you don't pay when you buy it, you will get billed, and there are a lot of people at the time who wrote that wealthy customers tend not to ever really get around to paying, and it's gauche to ask them to pay, right? But in the department store, you pay, and you pay cash, right? And you pay suddenly. And if you don't like what you bought, you can exchange it. Or if it doesn't look good when you take it home, right? You can never exchange something in the specialty shop, right? It was made for you, and it's clear. There's also this, and Philip Nord's book on French retail really gets at this very well. There's this kind of embarrassment or shame around the objects. These stores, they don't have the display windows. If you've read The Lady's Paradise, you can think of the display windows in the old-fashioned shops. They're dirty and dusty and basement stores in a way, right? The department store puts the object in the window, the lights shine on it. It gets beyond this kind of shame of attached to the object. It tries to bring in as many people as possible and hold them there as long as they want, thinking again that the store will kind of trigger people's Kauflust, their desire to buy things, right? And it's Kauflust, this kind of untranslatable term for the desire or the drive to buy, that becomes a leitmotif in department store representations of all kinds. An explanation for the store's power to attract teeming crowds of customers, excited throngs pressing up against the spectacular display windows. These consuming desires were said to be aroused through low prices. Again, the idea of low prices, beating the competitor, all of this is very much out of step with traditional retail, where you didn't talk about the price. So the price wasn't the same for everybody. It depended on how much you could pay. So the low price is made possible by high volume and rapid turnover, right? Department stores would even lose money on items sometimes because they had to clear the shelf. So the emphasis is on movement, turnover, keeping things going at all times, even if they have to mark down. Again, very much out of step with the traditional culture of retail. For department store opponents, including defenders of the interests of the specialty shopkeepers, the stores baited and trapped unsuspecting customers. They incited Kauflust through trickery and deception, through false advertising claims touting inferior products, which was not true, but that's the only way they could really understand how the department store could charge so little and make so much money still. That these claims contradicted the economic reality. Indeed, a department store's, I skipped one, that they preyed on naive consumers and circumvented ethical business practices, making it impossible for upright businesses to compete. But that's actually not the case. If a department store came to a neighborhood, it would usually help all of the businesses by attracting more foot traffic onto a block. So what Zola depicts in Lady's Paradise is really not historically accurate in that sense. And despite all of the I want to say hysteria, but it's kind of a fraught term, but despite all the excitement and concern about department stores, they never accounted for more than 5% of total German retail before World War II. and at their peak in the 50s, late 50s, is maybe 6.5%. So women's behavior in department stores was a source of particular concern. These are just images of fire. The department store fire is a very prevalent theme in German kind of politics and literature at the time. And women's behavior, as I was about to say, was a source of particular concern, and that really reflected unease about how and where women spent their time and their money, or their husband's money, as the case may have been. Critics claim that department stores exerted a nearly irresistible hypnotic effect on female shoppers. Indeed, the store's lure, the mesmerizing impact of advertising and display, also preoccupied psychoanalysts and psychiatrists who diagnosed epidemic kleptomania, or magazinitis, around the turn of the century, and blamed women's seemingly irrepressible drive to steal on the temptations of the department store environment and the allegedly weaker female constitution. Kleptomania was considered so inevitable that in an Austrian play from the 30s, Zwischenfall im Warenhaus, a wealthy man clandestinely purchased a department store so that his wife could indulge her stealing habit without any legal consequences. Okay, so I should keep track of the time. I've already talked a lot, so I'm going to just kind of try to move forward, if I can, into the other material. Just a few images of this kind of fear of the power of the department store. Yes?
Do you want us to ask questions afterwards?
Yeah, I think that would be the best, if you don't mind. And there's another theme I didn't really have time to develop here about this sort of supernatural quality of the department store that you see also in the literature. And here we have Thomas Taylor Heine's The Devil in the Department Store. So I'm going to...
Don't go so fast.
Oh, sorry. We can go back through.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I love the Schocken stores, but I had a chapter on them, but I want to move forward if I can. Well, I'll leave it on this for now. So the story of the Jewish department store, in a more literal way, of course, is over by 1939, by which time all Jewish-owned businesses had been taken out of Jewish hands. And at that point, the department store's Jewishness only functioned as a metaphor or a sign of a decadent past. And by that point, most of the people who'd played such a role in creating consumer culture in Germany, right? So not only the department store entrepreneurs, but also artists who worked on advertising campaigns, salespeople, buyers, architects. Most of them were not Jewish, but many of them were, and they'd also, as department stores, survived okay for a few years, but things got harder and harder for department stores by the time of the war. So this whole kind of sector in the German economy is really diminished, and those who had to flee or chose to flee, I wanted to ask what happened to them and think about kind of whether they were able to pick up where they left off in the United States. And one thing that I've noticed is that many people who we might think of as kind of engaged in the fine arts or higher artistic practice end up needing to make a living in the United States and get employed in American retail as designers and sort of become applied or commercial artists. And I really, if you'll allow me to kind of speak informally, having taught classes on consumer culture, and I, as you know, I teach at USC, and that's a topic that, I don't want to perpetuate any stereotypes, but that's a topic that hits home there, and I'm sure here too. But I started teaching about the mall and about advertising in the United States because that's what one would do in a consumer culture class, and these, of course, are quintessentially American phenomena, right? But I started to dig deeper, and I came across figures like Victor Gruen, who you just saw, and Ernest Dichter, who I'll speak about in a minute. And they, among others, really stand at the center of this newer project, this Exiles on Main Street project. So Gruen today is best known for designing the first mall, the first enclosed, air-conditioned American shopping space, the Southdale. I don't know if anyone's from Minnesota, the Southdale Mall outside of Minneapolis in Edina, Minnesota, which opened in 1956, which he worked on together with his partner Rudy Baumfeld, another architect of Viennese. Now we're getting into all these Austrians, Viennese Jewish origins. So Gruen, who was really Victor Grunfeld, having been immersed in Vienna's social democratic urban planning milieu. For him, traffic congestion and atomization were the enemy, the pitfalls of American suburban sprawl, right? So he came to the United States in 1938, started in New York working, he had a theater background in addition to being an architect, so he started working on Broadway and eventually made his way to California and had a big chunk, spent a good chunk of his career in Los Angeles, where he was, it stands to reason, concerned about traffic and noticed that it's a real pain to get in the car, and this is even in the 40s already, and drive to a store and park and then get in another, get back in and go to another store. And he thought about putting it all together and creating a retail experience where one would shop, where one would park on the perimeter and then come in and do all the shopping by foot. And specifically, he decided that the mall should be several floors because then you wouldn't have to walk as far, right? So basically where I'm going is he's trying, this is a very, what we now think of as very American, is based on a kind of transplanting of European, or in this case Viennese, ideas about urban planning into the American suburb. So people who study American retail talk about the Gruen effect or the Gruen transfer. And what they mean by that is a kind of manipulative retail strategy that aims to bedazzle customers with the store's brilliant array of goods so that they'll be drawn consciously or unconsciously to buy, and to buy beyond their means or any rational need. Scholars of post-war American consumer culture consider this a development of the 1950s, but looking at earlier periods of retail, as I've tried to do here, reveals that it's actually a much older phenomenon. The fear of this was actually a cornerstone of these critiques against the German department store, right, and this notion of Kauflust and the power of Kauflust. So what struck me as I think I can actually skip that, but so born Victor Grünfeld in Austria in 1903, Gruen studied architecture and design at Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts, and he was influenced by competing visions of architects and urban planners like Sitte, Wagner, and Adolf Loos. He came of age in post-World War I Red Vienna, where the governing Social Democrats were busily carrying out their ambitious public housing program for the city's working classes. Indeed, Grünfeld was drawn to social democratic circles, like the great majority of Vienna's Jews, and even after he started working architecture jobs during the day, he performed in political cabaret at night, mocking the Austrian bourgeoisie's pliancy and satirizing the church and right-wing movements in Austria. His father was a lawyer who worked for theaters. So Grünfeld's particular trajectory from the Jewish socialist modernist world of interwar Vienna to the American suburb lies at the heart of this new project, and already suggests it's one of its tentative implications. For another example, let's take the Bauhaus architect Karl Schneider. So here's Southdale, by the way, a more recent picture of Southdale. And another Gruen project. This one was demolished, but it's kind of near the airport in Los Angeles. And if you kind of look at the curve of this, it's a little bit evocative of this is the Stuttgart Schockenstore and the Chemnitz, this kind of Erich Mendelsohn modernist curve like that. So I mean, maybe I'm pushing it too far, but I do think we see some echo of the German department store design here in post-war Los Angeles. Okay, so Karl Schneider, Bauhaus architect, left, not Jewish, really the only not Jewish person I'm talking about today, left Hamburg really finding it difficult to work under those conditions, even though I wasn't Jewish, there are plenty of other reasons to leave, and went to work for Sears in 1938 in Chicago. After several years of designing toys, tools, and furniture, he became Sears' leading product and store designer and conceived of the firm's post-war expansion strategy. His plans for Sears stores in small and medium-sized cities like Portland, Oregon, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Buffalo brought the leading edge of German modernist architecture to middle American streets and the height of European design into American kitchens and living rooms. Then there's the case of the Vienna-born graphic artist. I just think this is a really beautiful drawing of his, of Sears store on Main Street, Anywheresville, USA. Joseph Binder, who was a commercial artist in interwar Austria and Germany, who emigrated to the US and became the chief designer of the United States Navy. Who knew the United States Navy had a chief designer? Until I started, I had no idea. Binder's posters for the New York World's Fair and his commercial work for United Airlines created iconic visual representations of American technological modernity and air power in the idiom of the pre-war European poster, Sachplakat, at the height of Cold War tensions. Okay, so I'm gonna just, I've kind of already said this, but I'll recapitulate it a little bit. If we want to reframe the mall in terms of Central and Western European theory and experience, it could be seen as transplanting an urban, pedestrian-centered perspective into the altered spatial geography of the expanding American city. So a contemporary review of Southdale, which opened in 1956, said the Southdale environment is quite unlike that of any other shopping center. There's nothing suburban about it except its location, for Southdale uncannily conveys the feeling of a metropolitan downtown. Southdale is not a copy of downtown, rather it's an imaginative distillation of what makes downtowns magnetic. The variety, the individuality, the lights, the color, even the crowds. So this passage about a shopping center in suburban Minneapolis could just as easily have applied to a Berlin shopping street in the 1920s. Southdale's central atrium was, okay, I'm going to skip that too, but I'll also, the Northland Shopping Center outside of Detroit, another Gruen project. Of that, critics noted its European influence. One author wrote that it evoked the strains of a Viennese waltz in European design traditions. Okay, so I'm going to just mention one more figure and then I will conclude. And that is Ernest Dichter, who was a psychologist who was an associate of Anna Freud's in interwar Vienna. Was born into a retail family. There was Warenhaus or Kaufhaus Dichter was the first department store outside of the Ring in Vienna. And Dichter was 4 years younger than Gruen, also Jewish, and was, again, didn't study design or architecture, but worked doing display windows while he was studying at university to make a little extra money. If Gruen, Baumfeld, and others created the American suburban vernacular in glass and concrete, Dichter is one of the key shapers of American advertising culture. Importing Freudian ideas and European attitudes toward sexuality, Dichter urged advertisers to play on consumers' sexual desires and the pleasures associated with acts of consumption. He was an early adapter of the modern test subject approach. He studied with Paul Lazarsfeld, the sociologist who also went from Vienna to New York. And he employed scores of social scientists and opinion researchers in his film studies of subjects' responses to goods and visual and audio stimuli. Among the many advertising campaigns he's remembered for, some of you will remember these, Exxon's Put a Tiger in Your Tank, Frito-Lay's Bet You Can't Eat Just One Potato Chip, which when I was a child seeing those on TV, I didn't think of Freud and the sexual undertones to it, and the early marketing of the Barbie doll. So little is made of Dichter's Jewish identity or his political affiliations in the existing literature, but one scholar remarked that the experience of European fascism, he left Austria in 1937 for Paris, eventually winding up in New York, that this shaped Dichter's views on consumer culture. Now I'm going to move into my conclusion. If people could achieve happiness and fulfillment through acts of consumption, he theorized, support for dictators and demagogues would wane. So I've only mentioned a few figures here, Gruen, Baumfeld, Dichter, Schneider, and Binder, but there are many more one could include, like people like Lazarsfeld, who I just mentioned, and Hertha Herzog and Ilse Zeissel, who were around him in public opinion research. Ernst Deutsch Dryden, another Austrian-born designer who worked in fashion. Architect Felix Augenfeld, Freud's nephew Edward Bernays, who was the creator of public relations in this country. The Hungarian George Katona, who brought psychology into the study of economics, Bernard Rudowski, the enigmatic architect and planner who hailed from Austrian Moravia, and the list goes on and on of, again, people who have these Central European origins and came here and were active in American consumer culture from the 40s on. So Gruen, it bears noting, gave up on the United States. He returned to Europe and spent his final years in Switzerland and Austria. the forces of the auto industry, the basically American real estate, and the stratification and segregation of the American suburbs they proved too powerful for his vision of a harmonious retail public sphere. Dichter, on the other hand, remained in the US and became a vocal champion of commercial capitalism and marketing culture. Indeed, journalist Vance Packard attacked him in his 1957 polemic against the advertising industry called Hidden Persuaders. And in her landmark 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan documented Dichter's cynical manipulation of educated housewife consumers in his ads for household appliances, detergent, and other domestic technologies. I can talk about that more if anyone wants. Jean Baudrillard treats Dichter as a poster child for the excesses of U.S. consumerism in his influential critique. So to conclude, just as Central European émigrés were so crucial in helping create the forms of American consumer culture in the post-war period, they were equally prominent among its critics, bringing Marxist perspectives together with a kind of Freudian social analysis in their treatments of consumer society and culture. These voices help forge the search for authenticity, the turn toward Eastern spirituality, and the broader, if ambivalent, rejection of consumerism in the student movement of the 60s and 70s. So I'll stop there to leave us time. I'm sorry I went on so long, but we can talk. I mean, I'm open to any questions, and in particular about the way these two pieces fit together. Maybe others will see more overlaps and cross connections than I indicated here. But thank you for listening, and look forward to your questions.